In this session, we're going to continue with jazz in the 1920s, just like we were talking about with Louis Armstrong in the last session. But this session will focus more on the bands rather than the solo performances. And although we will talk about several important soloists within those bands. I'm entitling this one Black and Tan Fantasy, after the very famous and celebrated song and movie by Duke Ellington. And we're going to focus really on Duke Ellington at the Cotton Club and then Don Azpiazu and the beginnings of Latin jazz. And we will return to later discussions of Latin jazz and later sessions. But today we're going to sort of talk about the very beginnings of Latin jazz in the U.S. It's talking about some important record companies in the 1930s. This is an era of the rise of the independents. If you'll remember, we were talking about a sort of three-way pursuit of the market in recordings among Edison, the Edison Phonograph Company, the Victor talking machine, and that was using Berliner technology, and then Columbia Records, which drew from both types of technologies. Now in the 1930s, you have a lot more competition. This is the rise of several smaller independent labels, many of which would record jazz and then what's called hillbilly music, and we'll return to a discussion of what that is just after the midterm. Brunswick is established in 1916, but it's not a real player, not a real piece of competition, a real source of competition until the 1920s. Vocalion was established in 1916 by the Aeolian Piano Company, the company that made player pianos, if you recall. They were bought out by Brunswick in 1925, and it's at that moment that Brunswick becomes something of a juggernaut. So a lot of early Ellington recordings are on Brunswick. They're a very important venue for early jazz. OK Records is established in 1916 and bought as a subsidiary to Columbia Records in 1926, but it's a subsidiary. This becomes a very typical move for major record companies. What they do is they buy up these smaller companies, but because the smaller companies have already established their own reputation, especially within certain types of music that maybe Columbia doesn't specialize in, like hillbilly music and like blues and like jazz, they keep the OK label as the OK label. It's just they are now getting a major part of the profits from that label. This allows OK to maintain a certain amount of independence, even though it's now being funded by a major label. And so it's a good deal for them in a lot of ways. Decca is a British label that's established in 1929 and becomes a major player in the 1930s. And then Bluebird is established in 1932 as a subsidiary of RCA Victor. So here you have, I've put in four, I didn't put in a Bluebird label, but you can see four of the labels there, the Brunswick label, OK, Decca, and Vocalion. You can also see, if you look closely, that there are these are examples of some pretty important recordings. One's by Victoria Spivey on Decca Records of Black Snake Swing. Vocalion has How Long Blues, and we'll talk about that recording later. That's a major recording. OK Records with a Clarence Williams release. Remember, we talked about Clarence Williams, who collaborated with Sidney Bechet and Louis Armstrong. So these are all fairly important recordings. And then Brunswick has a Vernon Dalhart, and we'll talk about him when we talk about early country music. RCA Victor in 1929, the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, purchases Victor, right? So it that was already a major label, and now it becomes even more important, Victor was then the largest manufacturer of gramophones and recordings. So this is a major business deal. This is a major conglomeration. The company's then known as RCA Victor, and it has a relatively young David Sarnoff as president, and you can see him there. David Sarnoff was really a visionary of technology at this time. He's very important for the development and popularization of radio. He figured out that people wanted a lot from radio, that they wanted popular music and they wanted advertisement, but they also wanted this sense that they were being connected to a larger cultural entity. And so one of the things David Sarnoff did, and it's not as pertinent to what we're doing because it involves classical music, but I'll mention it briefly here, is he hired a very famous conductor of the time, Toscanini. For a minute, it was escaping me, but he hired the famous Italian conductor Toscanini. Now, Toscanini already had a very good reputation conducting Italian opera and so on. And Toscanini was he had a slogan called that he would utter that said "come scritto," right? That he conducted "come scritto," as it was written. In other words, what he's saying he's doing is he's delivering you the music as the composer intended it. Now, of course, who knows what that would even mean, right? He thinks what he's doing is he's following the score very closely, that he's paying attention to all the various performance markings. Of course, Italian opera is notorious for being under-specific in that way. It expected the conductor to make a lot of decisions. A lot of times in Italian opera, the conductor would even bring in pieces from other operas to fill out the opera. But whether it's deserved or not, Toscanini had this reputation for doing things as written, right? For being very meticulous. And he was very meticulous. I don't particularly like his recordings, but he was very disciplined with respect to his orchestra. And Sarnoff puts him on radio and really promotes these performances as being it's being designed really to capture the brilliance of the Toscanini orchestra. So he works very hard with microphone development and microphone placement. He works very hard with the development of that specific studio in which Toscanini was going to play, that's designed for the acoustics of his orchestra. But not only that, the acoustics really of the radio. So he says that the live audiences that come to hear this aren't getting as good of a performance as the people from the radio. It's brilliant, whether it's true or not. This is also the early development of the 33 1/3 RPM recording, right? In 1929, Edison Records closes down. They just can't keep up with the competition from Columbia, Victor, and Brunswick especially, and now RCA Victor, right? So now these are the three biggest ones, Columbia, Victor, and Brunswick, and OK and Vocalion and these other companies are a bit smaller. In 1931, RCA Victor introduces the 33 1/3 RPM rotations per minute record as opposed to the 78. So this is an early and failed version of the 33 1/3. The 33 1/3 will come up later as a long playing record. At this time, it's not a long playing record. It's along the same dimensions as far as time goes as the 78. And it, like I said, it fails. It dies out in 1933, and it'll emerge with an entirely different design after World War II, and we'll talk about that then. But it's an important innovation. It's an early notion of the speed war in recording industry. How fast should a record go? And it has to do with what you get out of that record, right? 78s tend to be 2 songs, 1 per side. And at first, so was the 33 1/3. It had a slightly longer play time than the 78. But like I said, it dies out in 1933, and it will reemerge later, and we'll talk about it then. In 1938, CBS buys out Columbia. So notice that CBS is aligned with Columbia, and we'll see that RCA Victor gets aligned with NBC, and so it's aligned with these radio networks and later on TV networks. And this is a huge part of how the entertainment industry really becomes a big-time industry. It really becomes a proliferating and very influential industry. Duke Ellington and the Cotton Club, in the early 20s, Ellington renamed his band the Washingtonians, and they were playing in D.C. He was born in D.C. And then in 1923, they moved to New York City for a residency at the Kentucky Club on Broadway, and that's where they get their start, the Kentucky Club. It's one of the major jazz clubs. It's not, though, as important as for them as we'll see the Cotton Club will become. They make their first recordings in 1924 and then in 1926 for numerous companies, including Brunswick and OK. And they often record the same works for these different companies because there's no sense of a mechanical right. There's no sense in which when he records a tune at Brunswick that they think that they have some kind of ownership over that tune. And they're also not paying him royalties yet. He will soon establish that when he gets his manager, Irving Mills, who's much more canny about those kinds of things. But early on, you can hear recordings for Brunswick, for OK, for Victor that are the same piece. So, for instance, one of my favorite pieces from the 20s by Ellington is Mood Indigo. one of a lot of people's favorite pieces. It's a remarkable little piece of orchestration by Ellington, a great set of performances by Bubber Miley, the clarinetist, and so on. I'm sorry, Bubber Miley, the cornetist, and Barney Bigard, the clarinetist. And those two on those recordings of Mood Indigo, quite remarkable. But he recorded, one of the things that I like about this is that he recorded Mood Indigo several times, I think 6 times, in a fairly short number of years for all these various companies, Columbia, Victor, Brunswick, OK. He records it over and over again, and so you get to hear these slight changes in the arrangement, and sometimes rather marked changes in the arrangements. Eventually I'll get that right. And so you really get to hear the changeability of his genius, of his orchestrational genius. He supposedly came up with the song Mood Indigo in a waiting room, right? That he's humming it to himself in a doctor's waiting room and then wrote it out later. A big part of the song has to do with the orchestration. Again, it may have been developed in tandem with radio, which we'll talk about in a moment. He then becomes promoted and managed by Irving Mills, who gets him a contract with Columbia, and then you have fewer alternate versions. So after the 20s, you don't get a lot of alternate versions of these Ellington compositions because he's got his contract with Columbia. But then he starts working at the Cotton Club. The Cotton Club is one of the most storied places in New York of this time. It's a very famous club for a number of reasons. It's in Harlem, so it's uptown. It's an uptown club, unlike a lot of the downtown clubs. And it is a club where you have an all-black performance group, all-black entertainers and wait staff, but an all-white audience. It is a segregated club. Ellington will change that to some degree. He will be allowed to have a table where his mother can come and hear him and where other friends of his can come and hear him. But for the most part, it is a segregated club. It's a club during Prohibition that serves liquor, and not only does it serve liquor, but it serves gangster-endorsed liquor, because the person who runs the club is this man, Owney Madden. Owney Madden is a member of the Irish mob. He's sometimes known as the Duke of the West Side. He's a ladies' man, and so he's very interested in the nightlife in general. He's very interested in entertainment in general. He is one of the early bootleggers and one of the very successful bootleggers. In fact, he's so successful and he has so many ties to government and everything else that he's one of the few very prominent mobsters to be able to go retire, and he does. He leaves New York, he goes and retires in Iowa or something like that, and he dies a free man. He doesn't die being shot, or he doesn't die incarcerated. Doesn't die of violence. He is a mobster who's allowed to retire. And part of that is because he's hobnobbing with the elite here. Various people like Charlie Chaplin and other actors. Jimmy Durante, that's the one I'm trying to think of, is a major figure that keeps showing up at the Cotton Club. These are people that patronize his club, that rub elbows with him. And so even though he's involved in mob activities, he's also very much a part of public life. Kind of like Al Capone, but he doesn't have the same reputation for being as violent as Al Capone. There's no Valentine's Day massacre associated with Owney Madden. It's not that he wasn't associated with violence at all, or even committed some acts of violence, but he's certainly connected with plenty of illegitimate businesses, bootlegging being the most prominent. But because he's so connected with the elite of the entertainment world, of the white entertainment world, he gets a pass by and large. One of the things featured at the Cotton Club, of course, I mentioned that it's all black entertainment. And here you can see, I believe that's Cab Calloway. I couldn't zoom in close enough to see for sure, but it certainly looks like him in the background leading the group. And then up front you have the chorus girls. And just as we saw with Shuffle Along, the chorus girls in these various productions were often of lighter skin. You can see they're wearing rather short skirts, especially for the 1920s. and 30s, and they're this highly trained dance troupe. And what happens at the Cotton Club is you have a performer in residency. For a long time there, it was Duke Ellington, and then after Ellington left to go on a national tour, he was replaced by Cab Calloway, and that's who I believe we're looking at here. And they would have a series of songs that they would play, so they'd have sets that they would play, and then they would also do floor shows. And they would accompany the floor show. And the floor show would be performed by the actors and by the chorus girls. And the chorus girls would sing songs and then do these elaborate musical reviews with these highly choreographed dances. And that's what you're seeing. This is a still from one of those choreographed dances. Here's another picture of the chorus girls to give you a different sense. This is from Ellington's time, I believe, not Cab Calloway's time. We're going to see another picture where Ellington is very clearly in the picture here. And that is this one. And you can see again, more than just the chorus girls. This is obviously meant to be some kind of almost pirate, I guess, show. They did different shows with different themes. And so this floor show obviously had some kind of pirate theme to it, as you can see with the sort of swashbuckling outfits that the men up front and some of the women up front are wearing. And then the chorus girls with the more high glitter dresses and gowns and so on. So here's a picture of the floor show very clearly with Ellington at the piano and Sonny Greer at the drums. We'll talk about him in a moment. December 4th of 1927 is when Ellington starts his residency at the Cotton Club, which at that time was at 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue. King Oliver was originally refused. He was originally offered the gig and he refused it. He didn't want to give up what he was doing in the mid to late 20s. He was already very successful in both New York and Chicago, just touring in his own right. So he didn't want to tie himself down to a show like this, which was a nightly show. It was several hours every night, 6 nights a week. You got one night off, and some weeks you didn't even get that. So it was a very intensive show, and King Oliver didn't see any need to work that hard for the amount of money they were offering. But Ellington, really, his only real gig was at the Kentucky Club before this. He had some decent success there, but he was certainly not a big name yet. As I mentioned, the venue was segregated, a white audience and then black entertainers and white staff. But the big move up here from the Kentucky Club wasn't just that he was playing to more white audiences. There were also white audiences at the Kentucky Club, but they were integrated audiences. The people who were going to hear music at the white people who were going to hear music at the Kentucky Club were engaged in what was known as slumming at the time, right? A lot of white audiences would go to black clubs. In fact, they patronized the black clubs because there were black audiences. And there was this idea of, just like we saw with the Bowery in the beginnings of minstrelsy, there was this cultural notion that what one would engage in was this act of slumming, that you would see how, quote unquote, the other half lives. And it wasn't just black clubs that were involved in slumming. There were also gay clubs, especially in the 19-teens and 20s and early 30s. That was a big thing to go down to Greenwich Village, where there were a lot of gay nightclubs with people who would engage in cross-dressing, people who were engaged in same-sex coupling, same-sex relationships, who would be affectionate with each other in public. And white straight audiences would come to observe this. That was part of the entertainment, was watching the people that were involved. But this club had, the big step up here was that there was a wired connection for radio broadcasts. So most nights that Ellington was playing, people who were far away in, say, Davenport, Ohio, they were able to listen in on this. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but this is an important part of what it meant to be in this jazz band at this time. That this was becoming a national music. It was no longer just a Chicago or New York thing. He had an incredible roster of players. Wellman Broad on bass, who really helps develop the walking bass style, and we'll see who takes it further in a moment. Bubba Miley on trumpet, a very important player. Sonny Greer on drums, Barney Bigard on clarinet, Johnny Hodges on sax, and Tricky Sam Dan trombone. Here's Sonny Greer. Sonny Greer was a favorite among the mobsters, and you can see that they really lavished their attention on him. Look at all these drums. He's got the kettle drum. He's got these huge gongs. He's got the bells behind him, the long tubular bells behind him that he can play. He's got a vibraphone. He's got all sorts of things that drummers wouldn't normally have. And part of the reason is that he was he had a lot of fans among the mobsters. And so the mobsters would just buy him parts of his kit. And when they finally went on tour, he couldn't take it all. He had to have a major part. Ellington owned his own train. He became so famous and so popular in the 20s into the early 30s that he was able to buy his own set of train cars that would be linked up to a train. It wasn't his own train, but that would be linked up to a train that was going wherever he was going. And so that way he didn't have to worry about segregation. He didn't have to worry about dining cars and everything else. He had his own set of train cars. Well, one half of one of those cars was taken up by Sonny Greer's drum equipment, and he didn't even bring everything with him. That's how much attention the mobsters lavished on Sonny Greer. They thought of it as being part of their pride, I guess, that his drum set took up so much of the club. Now, I mentioned, and I want to continue to talk a little bit longer about the radio broadcasts and how important they were. The way this worked, basically, is you had an MC, a white MC, who would announce everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. He wasn't just announcing what songs were coming up or what floor show items were coming up. He's announcing who's coming into the crowd. So this was for the benefit, of course, of people who were not able to come to the nightclub, whether they were local in New York and just not able to come out to the nightclub for whatever reason, maybe couldn't afford it, or maybe didn't want to go up to Harlem or whatever reason. But it was also for the benefit, obviously, of the people in Davenport, Ohio, and other far-flung parts of the nation who were listening into this and wanted to get a sense of the nightlife. Part of what was exciting about the Cotton Club was that Owney Madden owned it, and that these very famous people like Charlie Chaplin and Jimmy Durante and other famous people of the nightlife would come in and be announced. Now, to some extent, some of the newspapers make fun of some of the Cotton Club broadcasts because they would announce even people who were only locally famous or maybe only kind of famous or only known to the MC himself or whatever. But it was part of giving the sense of the atmosphere, right? That you say, oh, well, look, Jimmy Durante just came in and he's going to sit at the table up to the front there, as he often does. And you can see that he's with some beautiful women tonight. And he's, who's that with him there? Is that maybe Douglas Fairbanks? And this whole bit of getting excited about who's involved, and that's part of what led to Ellington's increased fame. Now, part of that is also a kind of coding that goes on. Remember, I mentioned before the idea of hot music, sweet music, and Latin music, and we're going to talk about Latin music in a second. Ellington eventually developed certain Latin numbers. But he would alternate between hot music and sweet music, and sometimes the sweet music was written by various white composers. He worked very closely with some white composers for the various floor shows, so he didn't always compose all the music that was being performed there at the Cotton Club. Although he did compose music for the Cotton Club. The radio host would sometimes have a kind of coded way of speaking of things. And so one of the terms that's often used, and it's not, the reason for this is actually kind of complicated, but basically, think about it for a moment. White audiences are listening into this nightclub performing black music. And there's this fear with the radio that since you can't see what you're getting, you might be subliminally influenced by things that you're not aware of. But if you're aware of it, then it's okay. And so they would announce some of these compositions as being indigo compositions, right? Indigo ink, indigo being a darker ink, indigo therefore being a code word for black. That's where the term mood indigo came from. Apparently, Ellington didn't name it that. That was something that Irving Mills came up with as a name for the song. And it's just part of this code of it being black music. And you can hear radio announcers using them. Also, Ellington developed what he calls a jungle style for the dances, the floor shows, because a lot of the floor shows were meant to be exotica in some fashion or other. And so he develops this style in conjunction with Bubber Miley. And there you see Bubber Miley. Bubber Miley is a great cornetist and trumpet player. He's obviously very influenced by Louis Armstrong, but he also takes things in his own direction. Just like Joe Oliver, he's very adept at using mutes. And what he does is he combines the mute with what he develops as a growl technique, where he's basically just growling in his throat as he plays through the trumpet. And it creates this very distinctive sound that you'll hear. And you should listen to East St. Louis Tutelo, which was recorded several times in 1926 and 1927. Listen to any of them, but I'll put one on the Spotify list. And listen closely to the growl technique that he develops. This is soon adopted by other players like Tricky Sam Nanton on the trombone, and it becomes a very distinctive sound of jazz of the 20s and 30s, the growl technique. Here's Barney Bigard, the fabulous clarinetist in Ellington's band. Ellington developed a sophisticated orchestration style suited to the distinct abilities of the members of his group. In fact, he didn't even just write clarinet part or trumpet part in his scores. He would write the names of the players, Barney Bigard, Bubber Miley, and so on. So he really tailored them to what that particular performer could do well. He often used instruments in unexpected registers. So, for instance, Mood Indigo, which I've mentioned a few times, the clarinet's at the bottom, a bass clarinet, and it's beneath the high trombone, and then a muted trumpet, and those two exchange the upper voice here and there. Ellington often claimed that particular tune was written with a fourth instrument in mind, which is the microphone. He claims that when those instruments are close mic'd and they're in close proximity to each other, that they actually produce a fourth tone. Now, I know all of the early recordings of Mood Indigo. I haven't heard it personally, but I get a sense of what he might mean, that there is a sort of timbral effect, a warmth that proximity to the microphone brings out that is special about that haunting quality of that opening. You listen and you tell me if you hear a fourth voice. Here's Black and Tan Fantasy, two clips from that movie. Ellington appeared in several films. This one's from 1929. Then there's Check and Double Check from 1930 with Amos and Andy. These are two very different experiences in film, right? One I mentioned earlier with Armstrong, the importance of these films for the appearance of how jazz works, whether jazz is just something that comes naturally or if it's the result of effort and work. And then also the relative dignity and standing of African Americans as entertainers and as people who are taking their own lives in their hands, making their own decisions, creating their own worth, which is what creative work is about, right? Creating one's own worth by getting other people interested in your creative vision. In this movie, Black and Tan Fantasy, and you should take a look at it, it's on YouTube, you'll see that Ellington is portrayed as a very dignified fellow, a composer, in the fashion of say a Chopin or a Schubert. He's working in this fairly small studio of his apartment or whatever, but he's writing the music out. He's not making it up as he goes along. He's envisioning how it's all going to work out. I mean, that's a big part of it, are these sort of projections of how he's imagining the music, but it's no different from how we might depict in a film of this time Wagner or Chopin doing his work, doing their work. And that's an important part of the representation in these films. The Check and Double Check film is a very different affair. Ellington long regretted doing Check and Double Check. It's one of the films that tries to show Amos and Andy on the screen instead of, as you may recall, Amos and Andy is one of the most famous and celebrated radio shows of that time. It was so popular, actually, that department stores would actually shut down for the 15 minutes that it was on. The customers were still there, but there were no ringing of cash registers while Amos and Andy was on, and everyone apparently at the department store would just sit there for the 15 minutes or stand there. I imagine they would continue to browse, but they would listen to the show, and then the registers would start working again when the show was over. That's how famous it was. That's how popular it was. Commerce literally stopped for those 15 minutes per day when that show was on. Now, 1930 is still relatively early, or 30 is still relatively early in their career. And yet the film, which comes at the height of their popularity on the radio, wasn't nearly successful. And you can see why. It's a little more embarrassing. By the time you get to 1930, it's not that blackface has gone away. 1933 is when Mickey Mouse does their version of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And there are plenty of blackface moments in movies and whole movies dedicated to blackface that go right into the 60s. And then there are plenty of TV shows that have blackface elements that go right up until recently, until the last few years. So we're not talking about something unimaginable, and yet for some reason with Amos and Andy, by 1930 it was already something a little bit problematic to see them on the screen with the blackface, and they themselves, the two actors involved, were embarrassed by it and didn't want to do it again. And so when the television show came out of Amos and Andy, it had an all-black cast. In fact, it was the first national television show to have an all-black cast, and it didn't last very long because it was problematic on all sorts of levels. Some people liked it very much, of course, but the NAACP was very skeptical about it. They didn't like the fact that it was coming out of these minstrel traditions and so on. But still, that was the first television show that featured an all-black cast. And Ellington was on this movie. So was Barney Bigard. As you saw a moment ago, Barney Bigard was rather light-skinned, so he had to black up. He had to wear lamp black and coal in order to play in the movie. So it's an embarrassment in a lot of ways. It's not a particularly good movie. Even the performance in it by Ellington is not one of his better performances. It's one of those moments of embarrassment, and yet at the same time it is a moment where this very famous composer and musician is linking up with a very famous franchise, the Amos and Andy Show. So the Spanish tinge, we've talked about it before. If you recall, Jelly Roll Morton insisted that what made jazz jazz was that it had an element of this Spanish tinge, right? And this involves the early Afro-Cuban influence on jazz. In the 19th century, the habanera, which I mentioned was often used in the left hand of Jelly Roll Morton's piano playing, it became the first Cuban dance style to gain an international reputation and prominence. It was the first written, published music featuring an African-derived rhythm. It greatly influenced African American and white musicians in the South, and has a distinctive rhythm of dotted eighth, 16th, eighth, eighth, dump, da-dum, dump, dump, da-dum-dum. The really famous version of a habanera is, of course, from Carmen, right? One of her arias is a habanera, but you hear it all throughout early jazz and early blues as well. So, for instance, this rhythm was featured in the bass line of the 1914 publication of the very popular St. Louis Blues by W.C. Handy. And we'll be talking about that tune again when we talk about the history of the blues. And then Handy went on to use that rhythm in several other compositions, and as we saw, Jelly Roll Morton uses it quite a bit. In fact, we'll see that on the next slide as well. Jelly Roll Morton referred to this rhythm as the Spanish tinge and claimed it was an essential ingredient to early jazz. The rhythm figures strongly in the second half of the Big Four, an early jazz rhythm and feel supposedly developed by Buddy Bolden that was designed to be a syncopated alternative to the downbeat-heavy march rhythm. So a march rhythm tends to just bring out the 4/4 of the march, right? So either just 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, or bum ba 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 da dum bum ba da da dum bum ba ba bum ba ba bum ba 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 da bum 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 bum, right? So really just reinforcing without syncopation, reinforcing the underlying meter. The Big Four is doing something a little different. Let's look at just the bass drum for now, and you can see we have this syncopation, a couple elements of syncopation. One element is, of course, we get a 32nd note, really, which I'm going to wind up doing more as a sort of 16th, I'm pretty sure. But and then you get a syncopated emphasis on the and the 4. So something along the lines of 1, 2, 3, the 4, and 1, 2, 3, the ba da bum ba 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 ba, right? So this emphasis on the and then you can see the same kind of rhythm happens in the next measure, where just the downbeats left off. So that's another form of syncopation. Notice that the cymbals, which are represented by those X's, those are all on the ands of each beat. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, again, creating this drive that syncopation can often create. The part of the story of the move of Latin jazz into the United States has to do with Cuban son. Son is a dance genre of the 20th century. It's the most popular Cuban dance genre of the early 20th century. It's noted for its anticipated bass style, meaning that the bass usually plays a 16th note prior to the beat. So instead of being behind the beat, as we'll see with a lot of blues and some jazz playing, this is always pushing the beat in a very interesting way, giving it this constant sense of driving forward. And then you also have the use of the clave. A clave is, of course, two things. On the one hand, it's an instrument, so referred to in early minstrelsy as the bones, right? When we were talking about tambo and bones, what Bones was playing was the clave, these resonant sticks that carried out rhythm and that worked as a good background rhythm. And then clave can also refer to the actual rhythm being played, which tends to be a 2-3 development out of son. And we'll talk about what I mean by that in a moment, the 2 and 3 groupings. Other characteristics of son include the use of the trace, which is related to a guitar but not quite a guitar, the Hispanic vocal style, especially with those upper register ululations, these kind of cries in the upper register, and then call and response structure and the percussion that comes from a Bantu origin. Many people consider son to have arrived in Havana in 1920, and Havana, of course, being a market center in Cuba. It's from there that it becomes an international genre, and that it really arrives in Havana owing to the innovations of the trio Matamoros. They were founded in 1896, so they're 24 years into their career by the time they start recording. They're also not the first people to record, so actually they're even further along in their career, but some of the finest recordings of Cuban son come from them. The first group to record, though, is on the next slide, and that's the Sexteto Habanero. They're the first group to record as the Quarteto Oriental, the Oriental Quartet, for Columbia Records in 1917. So notice that Columbia Records is kind of emphasizing the otherness involved in this music by calling it the Oriental Quartet. The group later became known as the Sexteto Habanero, and it was formed in 1920 in Havana, so around the same time that the trio Matamoros are coming to Havana, and they recorded a series of successful recordings for Victor in New York City from 1925 to 1931. And these are the first recordings in the sexteto format that became, along with the septeto format, far more typical of son than the quartet format. The group consisted of Gerardo Martinez, singing and playing double bass and replacing the more traditional botuela, Guillermo Castillo on guitar and voice, Felipe Neri Cabrera, the very celebrated percussionist, on maracas and voice, Agustin Gutierrez on bongos, and Abelardo Barroso, a fairly famous singer of the time, singing the lead part and then playing maracas and claves. Once it became a septet, they added the very skilled and gifted cornet player Enrique Hernandez. And these recordings are remarkable in a number of ways. They're very clearly deriving from folk cultures, from more strictly speaking Cuban national cultures. And they're that same kind of mixture of the folk aesthetic and the urban aesthetic that we see in early jazz as well. And they have some popularity here in the United States, but what's really important about them is the influence that they're going to have on Latin jazz, really, which is why we're interested in them here. But they're really remarkable recordings in their own right. Here we see a couple pictures of the Sexteto Habanero in different parts of their career. Notice the emphasis on the guitars and percussion, and then, of course, the string bass in the middle in that second photograph. Now, Don Azpiazu and the rise of Latin jazz. In the early 30s, there were several Latin American bands. Remember, I told you that that jazz was basically divided into three types of bands. There were hot bands that were playing the more blues-oriented material, faster tempos, and so on. There were the sweet bands that were playing more romantic music for ballroom dancing and so on. And then there was the Latin bands. Well, now we're talking about the Latin bands. And really, they start to come to prominence in the early 1930s. And there are two that are super important. One is Don Azpiazu and his Havana Casino Orchestra. And then there's Xavier Cugat's Waldorf Astoria Orchestra. Not surprisingly, they played at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, right? So just like we saw with Paul Whiteman, many of these groups are named after the venue at which they're performing. These groups would play a variety of Latin styles, but the main influence came from Cuba, particularly a mix of the son, the rural song, and the danzón, an African-inspired ballroom dance. So that same mixture, as we said a moment ago, between folk and urban cultures that we see in early New Orleans jazz, right? That this is a confluence of different influences that then become something new, that have a sort of, it's not easy to say exactly when we move from one thing to another, right? That there's a sort of trajectory that's being enacted here and developed. Azpiazu included many virtuosic and celebrated musicians in his group. For instance, Julio Cueva on trumpet, Mario Bauza, the great composer of the 1940s, as we'll see, is on saxophone, and we'll talk more about his influence in upcoming sessions. Here's a promotional picture of Don Azpiazu. I can't tell if that's a piano. It kind of looks like it must be, but it could be some kind of table. I don't know. But you'll notice the parrot or whatever sitting next to him or standing next to him. Obviously a bid for kind of exoticism. Remember that we saw the first recordings of Cuban music were by the Quarteto Oriental, right? So this idea of exoticism is a big part of it, but there's still a sense in which he's obviously meant to be dignified. He's got a very welcoming sense to him, but he's sitting at either a writing desk or a piano. But underneath is some percussion instruments, and then on top is a cowbell, right? So there's a nice mixture here, I think, of sophistication and a kind of bid for rural exoticism. We're also going to look at the next bit of promotional material, which is this one. This is a card that would have been handed out to advertise or to commemorate people getting to hear this group. And you can see that the group there is set up in their place of performance in the hotel, and you can see the mural behind them of the sort of Arcadian classical naked ladies, right, in this idealized way. And notice the sort of hints towards symmetry, where at the very end of either end, the left and the right, there's a standing woman with some kind of scarf or some kind of cloth that she's holding, and then right next to each of them is a woman that's kneeling down or sitting down with her arm extended. So there's this attempt at a kind of symmetry. There are the three women in the middle, one facing right at you and the two sort of facing to the side in profile. There's this bid for elegance, this bid for Arcadian classicism, and then they have this Latin orchestra in front of them. And then the picture of Azpiazu, obviously, is a blow-up of him with that sort of congenial smiling face, and it's meant to show that he's sort of the guiding figure to this whole display. Azpiazu made his New York City debut in 1930. His show featured a pregón, a vending song called El Manicero, the peanut vendor, and it was composed by Moisés Simón and sung by Antonio Machín. They recorded it that same year as El Manicero for RCA Victor, and it sold over 1 million copies. It was awarded a gold disc long after the fact by the Recording Industry Association of America, which wasn't established until 1952. So this is an award that the song gets in retrospect, right? Now this song has the distinct clave rhythm. Now I didn't get a chance before to really clarify the tresillo, but Cuban son typically had a tresillo rhythm under it, and the most typical was 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 pa 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 ba, ba. So you're dividing the meter, you're dividing 4/4 into 3 uneven beats, right? 2 dotted quarter notes and a quarter note. Da 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 da. So it gives you this regularity, but it also gives a little bit of syncopation, a little bit of funkiness, a little bit of interest that's not just, 1, 2, 3, 4 or something like that where everything is perfectly even. It gives it a little bounce. If you can hear that distinction between 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, da, 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 da. The 1 is kind of flat, right? The straight quarter notes is kind of flat, whereas the tresillo gives it a little energy, gives it a little funkiness, as I said. Now, what a clave does is it combines the tresillo, the 3-part rhythm of one measure, with a 2 rhythm in the next measure. Sometimes that 2 rhythm is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So that you'll have something along the lines of ba 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 da 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 da. So that kind, and you can of course rearrange it. That's the 3/2 clave. You can also have it as a 2/3 clave, but it's just the same thing in reverse order. So it's da 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 da. Da, da. Now, we'll see this can get quite complicated. It seems quite simple. It's a sort of an easy way to indicate a kind of Latinate quality, but we'll see that as it develops in Latin jazz, it can become quite complicated, but it's an organizational feature, a rhythmically organizational feature of Latin jazz, and it's one of the characteristic sounds. Now, this song inspires a rumba craze that persisted throughout the decade. Strictly speaking, El Manizero is not a rumba. It's a son pregón. But rumba becomes a generic name for Cuban music in the 1930s, and Azpiazu can be seen as a sort of founding father of that. Now, there are a couple more things to say quickly. One is you can see this release from Victor and notice the Spanish language for most of what's being discussed, even though they say in English that it's recorded in the USA. You can see Antonio Machín there in his sort of garb that he would wear. He would often kind of act out the part. He would play maracas while he's doing it, but he's supposed to be the peanut vendor, right? And so there's a sort of double entendre here, that the peanut vendor is selling his wares while the men are off at work, and he's selling them in the neighborhoods, and he's calling out to the windows, "Oh, come down and get my hot, steamy peanuts," right? And there's this implication there that there might be something kind of sexual in it, that it on the one hand is parodying the street cries of vendors, but on the other hand it's intimating, at least possibly, an intimation of a kind of sexual dalliance or whatever. So there's a bit of a kind of muted, naughty quality to this music that makes it an incredibly famous and celebrated tune, and we'll see that it comes back. Stan Kenton, for instance, who does quite a lot of Latin jazz in his highly sophisticated version of big band jazz, we'll hear that he has a version of it, and we'll see that it has a lot of staying power. It shows up in a lot of movies. The Marx Brothers reference it in at least one movie. There are other movies that have whole scenes surrounding the peanut vendor. It was a fad, a bit of a fad. Novelty song, like a lot of early jazz was, like a lot of early Latin music will be, at least among the larger public. It's considered something of a fad, and yet that novelty aspect of it is part of what sells it. Keep in mind, when I say things like fad or novelty, I'm not necessarily denigrating them, right? Remember that consumer capitalism is based on the idea that you're supposed to get very excited about the latest thing right now, and then you're supposed to get over it to go on to the next latest thing, that you're always worried about being at the cutting edge. I live here with a 9-year-old about to turn 10, and he's very concerned with the fact that people know that at one point he dabbed that silly move that they made. It's not exactly a dance move, it's more of just a pose, right? But he thinks of that as now being, as he puts it, cringy, because it's passed out of popularity, and it's replaced by all sorts of other things, other TikTok dances and so on that they do. the idea is that these fads, these novelties, they're not supposed to have longevity. They're supposed to get you very excited for a very short time, and then you move on to the next thing, and you get very excited about that, and then you forget about and even perhaps look down upon the things that you did before because you've moved past it to the next bit of novelty, whether that's inane or interesting or somewhere in between.